The battle for Tikhvin, fought between late October and early December 1941, emerged as one of the decisive yet lesser-known confrontations of the Eastern Front. To understand its significance, one must consider the precarious state of the Soviet Union in autumn 1941. Operation Barbarossa, launched by Nazi Germany in June, had brought the Red Army to the brink of collapse. Army Group North, under Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, had already encircled Leningrad by September, severing most land connections and initiating a blockade intended to starve the city into submission. Tikhvin, a small but vital town east of Leningrad, became central to both sides because it stood on the last remaining rail and road network connecting the besieged city to the broader Soviet interior. The region's terrain, dense forests, marshlands, and unpaved roads offered natural obstacles, yet the German High Command saw in Tikhvin a gateway to completing the isolation of Leningrad and linking with Finnish forces advancing from the north. For the Soviet Union, the fall of Tikhvin would have spelled disaster beyond the siege itself. The town's capture would sever the tenuous supply line running from Lake Ladoga and cut off hopes of sustaining the city through the coming winter. Politically, Stalin and the Stavka were unwilling to allow another major loss after the fall of Kiev and Smolensk, fearing that further retreats would embolden Axis propaganda and weaken the Soviet home front. Despite catastrophic losses in personnel and materiel, the Red Army rushed reinforcements, including freshly raised Siberian divisions, to the region. Intelligence reports underestimated the strength of German formations, while German planners, confident in the momentum of their 1941 campaign, similarly miscalculated the Red Army's ability to regroup and counterstrike in such inhospitable terrain. Both sides prepared for what would become a grueling clash, one shaped as much by weather and geography as by strategy. The opening phase of the battle unfolded in late October 1941, as the Wehrmacht's 16th Army, spearheaded by the Extwasnyoslide Motorized Corps, launched its drive toward Tikhvin. German operational plans called for a rapid breakthrough to seize the town, cut the last rail line, and push toward the Svir River to meet Finnish forces, thereby completing a northern pincer around Leningrad. Initial advances were swift, as the weakened Soviet 4th and 52nd Armies struggled to hold defensive lines in the face of experienced panzer and infantry divisions. Towns along the Volkhov River fell one after another, their populations displaced or conscripted for forced labor. German High Command, emboldened by these successes, began to broadcast propaganda proclaiming the imminent fall of Tikhvin as proof of the Red Army's impending collapse. On the Soviet side, Stavka recognized the grave danger and appointed General Kirill Meretskov, recently released from NKVD custody, to oversee the defense and counteroffensive in the region. Meretskov coordinated remnants of battered units with reserves drawn from Siberia and the Urals, many of whom arrived ill-equipped for the rapidly worsening winter conditions. The Red Army began constructing fortified lines east of Tikhvin, while local civilians, despite the harsh weather, dug trenches and aided logistics. Stalin's directives emphasized the symbolic and strategic necessity of holding the town, both to maintain morale and to keep Leningrad tethered to the Soviet interior. The stage was set for a clash where neither side could afford retreat, with Tikhvin's modest rail junction elevated to a focal point of the broader struggle for the north. Strategic goals for both armies were clear, yet fraught with logistical and operational challenges. For Germany, the seizure of Tikhvin would allow Army Group North to sever the last Soviet lifeline to Leningrad, ensuring the city's starvation and freeing divisions for redeployment to Moscow, where Operation Typhoon faced stiffening Soviet resistance. The Germans also sought to link with Finnish forces near Lake Onega, fulfilling a strategic vision of isolating the Soviet Northwest entirely. However, supply lines were already stretched thin, reliant on improvised roads rendered nearly impassable by rain and mud, and later by snow and ice. Fuel shortages, mechanical breakdowns, and a lack of winter equipment hampered the offensive even before Soviet countermeasures took effect. For the Soviets, the defense and eventual retaking of Tikhvin became a linchpin in their broader strategy to stabilize the northern front. Stavka directed the creation of the Volkhov Front to coordinate operations, drawing on reserves that had been earmarked for Moscow. While propaganda painted a picture of inevitable Soviet resilience, internal reports reflected dire shortages, insufficient winter gear, ammunition rationing, and dwindling food supplies. Nevertheless, the presence of Siberian troops, accustomed to cold-weather warfare, provided a crucial advantage. Soviet planning relied not on a single decisive battle, but on attrition, using the harsh environment and stretched German supply chains to wear down the attackers before launching a counterstroke. Both sides prepared for a confrontation that would hinge as much on endurance as on firepower. The battle's first major engagements erupted in early November, as German forces closed in on Tikhvin. The ex-Yesksyestais Motorized Corps, supported by elements of the 18th Army, pressed through forests and across frozen marshes, driving Soviet defenders from outlying villages and cutting smaller rail spurs feeding the town. The capture of the rail hub at Budagoshch signaled a tightening noose, prompting panic among some Soviet commanders who feared another encirclement akin to Kiev. Civilian populations in the path of the offensive faced evacuation under harrowing conditions, with thousands marching through snow and ice toward the east. Yet the German advance was not without setbacks. The worsening weather, marked by blizzards and plunging temperatures, stalled mechanized units, while Soviet counterattacks along the Volkhov River disrupted supply convoys and isolated forward spearheads. Despite these obstacles, German forces entered Tikhvin on November 8, 1941, securing the town after heavy street fighting. The occupation was brief but brutal. German engineers worked to repair the damaged rail facilities, intending to redirect supplies toward Leningrad, while occupation authorities requisitioned local resources, leaving civilians to endure extreme privation. The fall of Tikhvin, broadcast in German media as a decisive victory, sparked alarm in Moscow and desperation within Leningrad, where the prospect of total isolation loomed. However, even as German forces consolidated their gains, the seeds of their reversal were being sown. The overstretched lines, lack of reinforcements, and the onset of one of the harshest winters in decades set the stage for a Soviet counteroffensive that would soon reverse the tide. Escalation followed swiftly, as Soviet forces, bolstered by Siberian reinforcements and reorganized under the Volkhov Front, launched repeated counterattacks throughout November. These assaults, though costly, slowed the German consolidation and forced von Lieb's command to divert scarce resources to defend extended flanks. The terrain, now blanketed in deep snow, rendered many roads unusable, compelling German units to rely on sledges or abandoned Soviet supply depots for sustenance. Frostbite and illness began to claim as many casualties as combat, while morale declined amid growing recognition that the rapid victory promised by Berlin was slipping away. Political tensions surfaced as Hitler, frustrated by the delays and mounting losses, intervened directly in operational decisions, forbidding withdrawals and demanding the retention of Tikhvin at all costs. For the Soviets, the escalating conflict carried its own costs. Repeated assaults drained manpower and equipment, with entire rifle divisions reduced to fractions of their strength. Yet morale was buoyed by the knowledge that holding or retaking Tikhvin could keep Leningrad alive and prevent the city from suffering the full weight of famine and bombardment. Soviet propaganda emphasized the heroism of local civilians and troops, portraying the struggle as emblematic of national survival. Internationally, the battle received limited attention compared to Moscow, but it contributed to a broader perception of Soviet resilience, bolstering Allied confidence that Germany's winter campaign might falter across multiple fronts. The peak of the campaign came in late November and early December, as Soviet forces launched a coordinated offensive aimed at encircling and expelling German units from Tikhvin. Under Merezkov's direction, the Volkov and Fourth Armies executed pincer movements, targeting the overextended flanks of the ex-Csen's motorized corps. Artillery barrages, coupled with close-quarters infantry assaults, gradually pried German troops from their positions. The weather, now dipping to temperatures as low as -30 degrees Celsius, compounded the Wehrmacht's difficulties, immobilizing vehicles and freezing lubricants, while Soviet troops, better acclimated and equipped, exploited the conditions to their advantage. Crucial to the Soviet success was the disruption of German logistics. Partisan activity intensified, ambushing convoys and severing communications. The Luftwaffe, constrained by fuel shortages and limited daylight, could not provide consistent air support. As casualties mounted and supplies dwindled, von Lieb requested permission to withdraw, a plea that was initially denied by Hitler but ultimately became unavoidable. On December 9th, German forces abandoned Tikhvin, retreating westward under harrowing conditions, leaving behind significant equipment and thousands of frostbitten or incapacitated soldiers. The recapture of Tikhvin marked a rare and vital Soviet victory during the grim winter of 1941. Resistance and adaptation on both sides had defined the later stages of the battle. German units, despite dwindling strength, constructed hasty defensive positions during their retreat, attempting to delay Soviet pursuit and protect vital supply corridors to Army Group North. Their improvisation, however, could not offset the cumulative effects of overextension, logistical breakdowns, and the relentless Soviet offensive. For the Red Army, the victory at Tikhvin became a rallying point, showcasing the effectiveness of integrating Siberian troops and exploiting environmental conditions. The psychological impact on Soviet forces was profound, reinforcing the belief that the Wehrmacht could be stopped and even driven back, despite its apparent invincibility earlier that year. The turning point, cemented by the Soviet recapture of Tikhvin, had far-reaching consequences beyond the battlefield. The victory preserved the tenuous supply routes to Leningrad, allowing the Soviets to sustain the besieged city through the harsh winter via the Road of Life over the frozen Lake Ladoga. For Germany, the failure to hold Tikhvin foreshadowed the unraveling of their winter campaign, with Army Group North forced into a defensive posture that persisted for the remainder of the siege. The battle underscored the limitations of German blitzkrieg tactics in extreme weather and against resilient opponents capable of rapid redeployment and adaptation. In the aftermath, the retreat from Tikhvin cost the Wehrmacht thousands of men and significant material, weakening their ability to press further offensives in the north. Soviet casualties were similarly heavy, with entire formations decimated, but the strategic outcome justified the sacrifice in the eyes of Stalin and the Stavka. The immediate humanitarian crisis was severe as civilians returned to a devastated town lacking food, shelter, and infrastructure. Yet the reopening of the supply line mitigated the worst-case scenario for Leningrad, providing a lifeline that, though perilous, kept the city alive. The legacy of the Battle of Tikhvin endures as a testament to the interplay of strategy, endurance, and environmental hardship on the Eastern Front. Though overshadowed by larger engagements like Moscow and Stalingrad, the battle played a pivotal role in stabilizing the northern sector and ensuring Leningrad's survival. Politically, it demonstrated to both domestic and foreign observers that the Soviet Union retained the capacity to mount effective counteroffensives even amid devastating losses. The battle also prompted changes in German operational thinking, emphasizing the need for better winter preparation, a lesson only partially applied in later campaigns. Today, Tikhvin is commemorated in Russian military history as a turning point, a clash where resilience and adaptation overcame momentum and force, altering the trajectory of the war in the north. The opening phase of the battle began to unfold in late October 1941 as Army Group North, commanded by Field Marshal Wilhelm Ritter von Leeb, launched its concentrated thrust toward Tikhvin. The German 16th Army, reinforced by the Extras motorized corps, became the spearhead of the operation. Its objectives were to breach Soviet defenses along the Volkhov River, capture Tikhvin, and extend the advance to the Svir River, where it would link with Finnish forces to complete a northern encirclement of Leningrad. These plans reflected the High Command's belief that the Red Army, already mauled in previous encirclements at Smolensk and Kiev, lacked the capacity to resist a sustained offensive in the northern sector. The Germans anticipated another rapid advance, with expectations that Soviet resistance would crumble before the onset of the deep winter. Initial movements showed signs of validating this confidence, as German units seized several key crossings over the Volkhov, dislodging weakened Soviet formations tasked with defending a front too vast for their limited manpower. For the Soviets, the sudden escalation along the Tikhvin axis presented both operational and psychological challenges. The Soviet 4th and 52nd Armies, already strained from earlier fighting, were tasked with delaying the German thrust despite lacking adequate reserves and suffering from shortages of artillery and motorized transport. Commanders attempted to organize a layered defense, but the rapid pace of the German advance made coordinated maneuvers difficult. Orders from Moscow emphasized the need to buy time until reinforcements, including elements of Siberian rifle divisions, could arrive to stabilize the front. At the same time, local civilian populations were ordered to assist in constructing defensive earthworks and to evacuate vital supplies eastward, often under artillery fire. The mood among Soviet troops and civilians was grim but resolute, driven by the understanding that Tikhvin's loss would likely seal Leningrad's fate. Even in these early days, Stavka viewed the town as a linchpin for the survival of the northern sector. The first German successes heightened the sense of urgency on both sides. Towns such as Kirishi and Budogoshch fell quickly, their capture threatening to cut minor rail links feeding supplies into Tikhvin. German reconnaissance units, using light armored vehicles, probed deep into Soviet rear areas, attempting to disrupt reinforcement routes and gather intelligence on defensive preparations. The Soviets, in turn, relied heavily on scorched earth tactics, destroying infrastructure to slow the German advance and denying local resources to the occupiers. Despite these measures, by the first days of November, German vanguards were within striking distance of Tikhvin. Their progress slowed more by worsening weather than by Soviet resistance. Rain and the onset of snow turned the forest roads into quagmires, bogging down vehicles and forcing infantry to slog through waist-deep mud and slush, foreshadowing the logistical nightmare that would soon afflict the offensive. Within the German High Command, confidence remained high despite the emerging difficulties. Propaganda broadcasts celebrated the drive as another step toward sealing Leningrad's fate, presenting the advance as proof of German military superiority. Yet logistical officers reported growing concerns. Fuel consumption exceeded expectations, spare parts for armored vehicles were scarce, and supply lines stretched dangerously thin across difficult terrain. These problems, though significant, were still considered manageable, with most German commanders assuming the operation would be concluded before winter reached its harshest extremes. Von Leeb, under pressure from Berlin, urged his corps commanders to maintain momentum at all costs, emphasizing speed over consolidation, a directive that would later amplify the vulnerability of his forward units. On the Soviet side, Stavka acted decisively to avert a collapse. General Kirill Meretskov, recently reinstated after his release from NKVD detention, was placed in command of operations in the Volkhov sector. Meretskov immediately began consolidating remnants of shattered units into coherent formations, coordinating their efforts with reinforcements en route from the east. His priority was to hold the approaches to Tikhvin long enough for reserves to establish a viable defensive line. The Red Army also began laying the groundwork for future counteroffensives, stockpiling ammunition and fortifying fallback positions, even as frontline units fought desperate holding actions. The situation remained critical, with Soviet commanders aware that failure to delay the Germans could lead to another encirclement, comparable in scale to earlier disasters that had decimated the Red Army during the summer and autumn campaigns. Strategic planning for the battle around Tikhvin evolved rapidly as the stakes became clear to both German and Soviet commands. For the Germans, the seizure of the town was more than a tactical maneuver. It was intended to serve as the final blow, isolating Leningrad completely and creating a continuous front with Finnish forces. Army Group North's leadership envisioned that once Tikhvin was secured, supply lines could be rerouted to support a protracted siege and free up divisions for redeployment to assist in the critical offensive toward Moscow. This plan assumed that Soviet forces would be unable to mount an organized response in time, underestimating both their capacity to mobilize reinforcements and the logistical nightmares posed by the region's terrain and weather. The German High Command allocated significant resources, but the pace of operations relied on mobility and mechanization, advantages that were rapidly eroded by the early onset of winter. Supply and logistics became defining issues for the German advance even before reaching Tikhvin. The heavy rains of October had churned roads into deep mud, and as temperatures dropped, snow and ice further obstructed transport routes. Fuel shortages grew acute, exacerbated by the distance from primary depots and the need to prioritize deliveries for the more strategically critical operations near Moscow. German armored units, essential for breaking Soviet defensive lines, suffered increasing mechanical failures and spare parts were scarce. The reliance on horse-drawn wagons, a legacy of Germany's logistical limitations, slowed the movement of ammunition and food, undermining the very speed upon which their offensive strategy depended. These growing supply issues contrasted sharply with the propaganda emanating from Berlin, which portrayed the operation as a near-certain success, poised to crush the last Soviet footholds in the region. On the Soviet side, the strategic goal was survival and counteraction rather than immediate victory. Stalin and the Stavka understood that a failure to hold the Tikhvin line would not only condemn Leningrad, but also risk the collapse of the Northern Front, opening the way for German forces to press deeper into the Soviet interior. To prevent this, they committed valuable reserves from the Urals and Siberia, formations originally slated to reinforce the Moscow sector. These troops, better equipped for cold weather operations and seasoned in winter conditions, were rushed to the Volkhov front despite the logistical difficulties of long-distance rail transfer and the acute need for forces elsewhere. Soviet planners, while aware of their material disadvantages, counted on the environment, the resilience of their troops, and the overextension of German forces to wear down the offensive long enough to enable a decisive counterstrike. Propaganda played a significant role in both camps during this phase. German broadcasts heralded the operation as evidence of Soviet weakness, framing Tikhvin as the final step toward Leningrad's destruction. Meanwhile, Soviet media depicted the defenders as the shield of the North, emphasizing the heroism of troops and civilians digging trenches, building barricades, and enduring the brutal conditions to prevent the enemy from closing the noose. These narratives aimed not only to bolster domestic morale, but also to influence international perceptions, as Moscow sought to reassure its allies that Soviet resistance remained unbroken despite a series of devastating setbacks across the front. As both sides solidified their plans, the importance of Tikhvin's rail junction became paramount. The town's connection to the Northern Rail network, allowed the Soviets to move supplies toward Lake Ladoga, sustaining Leningrad through the tenuous road of life. For the Germans, capturing these lines would cripple Soviet logistics, forcing the Red Army to rely entirely on overland ice routes and airlifts, neither of which could support the besieged population and military garrison through the winter. This convergence of strategic priorities transformed a modest town into a critical objective, shaping the deployment of forces and the decisions made by high command on both sides. The final preparations set the stage for a series of clashes that would see both armies testing the limits of endurance, with the environment itself emerging as a decisive factor. The battle's first major engagements erupted in early November 1941 as German spearheads pressed into the outskirts of Tikhvin. The ex-Tikhvin's motorized corps, supported by elements of the 18th Army, forced crossings over frozen rivers and moved through the snow-covered forests, exploiting gaps in the overstretched Soviet defenses. Villages along the approaches, including Budagoshch and Malaya Vishera, became flashpoints as hastily assembled Soviet units attempted to delay the advance through stubborn rearguard actions. These defensive efforts slowed the German timetable but could not halt the offensive momentum. Civilians trapped in the path of the advance faced forced evacuations or were conscripted by German units to clear roads and support supply operations. The suffering was compounded by the plunging temperatures, which strained both armies but began to disproportionately affect the Germans, whose equipment and uniforms were ill-suited for the rapidly deteriorating conditions. Despite the obstacles, German forces achieved their immediate objective by November 8th, seizing Tikhvin after fierce urban combat. The fighting within the town was brutal and methodical, with Soviet defenders relying on barricades, sniper positions, and close-quarters ambushes to slow the attackers. German units, accustomed to mobile operations in open terrain, were forced into house-to-house battles that consumed time and resources. When the Red Army finally withdrew, it left behind a ruined town stripped of much of its infrastructure. German engineers moved quickly to repair the damaged rail lines and establish a forward logistics hub, aiming to integrate Tikhvin into the broader supply network feeding the siege of Leningrad. Berlin presented the capture as a major victory, proclaiming that the final isolation of Leningrad was imminent and that Soviet resistance in the north was nearing its breaking point. For the Soviets, the fall of Tikhvin was a severe blow, but not a fatal one. Stavka immediately ordered preparations for a counteroffensive, prioritizing the redeployment of Siberian divisions and additional armor to the Volkhov sector, despite the strain this placed on the Moscow defenses. General Meretskov coordinated with local commanders to form new defensive lines east of Tikhvin, using the dense forests and frozen rivers to create natural choke points. Supply convoys carrying ammunition, winter clothing, and food were rushed to forward positions, often under Luftwaffe attack, to sustain the troops as they prepared for renewed fighting. Morale, though shaken, was bolstered by the promise of reinforcements and the growing belief that the Germans, already showing signs of overextension, could be forced onto the defensive if enough pressure was applied. The civilian population endured extreme hardship during this phase. Many of Tikhvin's inhabitants had been evacuated during the German advance, but those who remained faced requisitions, forced labor, and the destruction of homes and food stores. Soviet propaganda emphasized their suffering as a rallying cry, portraying the fight to retake the town not only as a military necessity, but as a moral obligation to liberate fellow citizens. Simultaneously, Soviet intelligence reported that German logistics were faltering, with fuel and rations failing to keep pace with frontline needs. These vulnerabilities, compounded by the cold and the strain of maintaining extended supply lines, offered a critical opening that Soviet planners intended to exploit. Unexpected setbacks also began to erode German confidence. The worsening weather made it nearly impossible for mechanized units to maneuver, forcing reliance on sledges and captured Soviet wagons. Soviet counterattacks along the Volkhov River disrupted key supply corridors, isolating forward battalions and forcing the Germans to divert combat units to guard their own logistics. The rapid victory promised by von Lieb now seemed increasingly elusive, as his corps commanders reported rising casualties, equipment losses, and growing fatigue among their men. While Berlin still pressed for continued advances toward the Svir River and eventual contact with Finnish forces, operational realities on the ground suggested that holding Tikhvin itself might soon become a challenge, especially as Soviet forces regrouped for their counterstroke. Escalation of the fighting around Tikhvin came quickly in the weeks following the German occupation, as Soviet High Command threw every available resource into the effort to stabilize the front and prepare for a counteroffensive. By mid-November 1941, the Volkhov Front, formally established to unify the sector, had begun receiving reinforcements from Siberia and the Urals. These troops, hardened by their experience in extreme conditions and better equipped with winter clothing and skis, contrasted sharply with the German soldiers, many of whom were ill-prepared for the brutal cold and lacking essential gear. General Meretskov, overseeing the sector, adopted a strategy of attrition to wear down the German forces before launching a decisive blow. Soviet units initiated frequent raids and localized counterattacks against German supply columns and isolated forward detachments, aiming to disrupt logistics and drain German manpower through continuous engagements. For the Germans, the rapid descent into winter became an enemy as formidable as the Red Army itself. Temperatures plunged to levels rarely experienced by the largely Western European troops, reaching -30 degrees Celsius at night. Vehicles and weapons froze, lubricants solidified, and soldiers without proper winter uniforms suffered frostbite in staggering numbers. Entire companies were rendered ineffective without direct Soviet engagement. The logistical problems, already evident during the advance, now spiraled into crises. Fuel deliveries lagged, food supplies spoiled or froze, and the ad hoc road networks collapsed under the weight of constant use and snow accumulation. Von Lieb's reports to Berlin described a deteriorating situation, but Hitler's insistence on holding Tikhvin at all costs meant no relief in the form of withdrawal or consolidation was granted. Political tension within the German command structure compounded these challenges. Hitler's directives forbidding retreat clashed with the assessments of field commanders, who warned that holding the town might result in encirclement if Soviet pressure continued to build. Supply shortages, combined with the inability to rotate exhausted units, began to sap morale across the 16th Army and 18th Motorized Corps. Propaganda, which had triumphantly announced the capture of Tikhvin as a prelude to Leningrad's fall, now became a burden, as withdrawing without a fight would be a public admission of failure. The German High Command thus doubled down on its efforts to maintain the position, even as the situation grew increasingly untenable. Meanwhile, the Soviet buildup accelerated. The influx of Siberian divisions allowed Meretskov to plan a series of coordinated strikes designed to stretch the German lines and probe for weaknesses. Artillery units, though limited in ammunition, were concentrated along critical sectors to soften German defenses before infantry assaults. Soviet engineers improved supply routes through the forests, constructing makeshift roads and depots to keep their advancing units provisioned despite Luftwaffe harassment. Civilian participation was vital. Thousands of locals aided in the transport of supplies by sled and rebuilt infrastructure under dire conditions. This collective effort enabled the Red Army to sustain momentum despite the same environmental hardships crippling their enemy. The civilian plight, both within the recaptured Soviet territories and inside besieged Leningrad, added a sense of urgency to Soviet operations. The continued German hold on Tikhvin threatened the last remaining overland supply connection to Lake Ladoga. and with it, the viability of sustaining Leningrad's population through the winter. Stavka viewed the recapture not only as a strategic necessity, but also as a lifeline for the city, where food shortages were already claiming thousands of lives weekly. Propaganda emphasized the dual stakes, national survival and humanitarian relief, as justification for the relentless Soviet assaults, despite the heavy casualties they incurred. By late November, the battlefront had transformed into a grinding stalemate of attrition, punctuated by sharp, localized clashes and constant skirmishing along frozen rivers and snow-clad forests. The Soviets, though suffering significant losses, steadily eroded German strength by forcing the overstretched 16th Army to defend an ever-expanding perimeter with dwindling supplies. German commanders increasingly relied on static defenses and emergency airlifts to sustain their forces, but the Luftwaffe's limited reach and worsening weather made even these measures unreliable. The escalating crisis made it clear that a decisive confrontation was imminent, with the outcome likely to hinge on which side could better endure the unrelenting cold and the cumulative strain of a campaign far beyond its intended scope. The peak of the fighting erupted in late November and early December 1941, as the Red Army, reinforced and reorganized, launched its largest coordinated operations to reclaim Tikhvin. Under General Meretskhov's direction, the Volkhov Front combined the 4th, 52nd, and elements of the 54th Armies into a concentrated effort designed to encircle the German Reichsdienst motorized corps and sever its tenuous lifelines. Soviet forces struck along multiple axes, attacking not only the town itself, but also the critical roads and rail lines westward toward Muga and Kirishi, cutting German units off from their main depots. Artillery bombardments, though limited in scope due to supply constraints, were timed to coincide with infantry assaults, exploiting gaps in the German defensive positions that had been thinned by attrition and illness. The fighting unfolded amid some of the harshest winter conditions of the entire Eastern Front, with blizzards, sub-zero temperatures, and ice-laden winds transforming the battlefield into a frozen wasteland where survival itself became as much of a challenge as combat. German units, already strained by weeks of exposure and under constant harassment, struggled to hold their positions against this renewed onslaught. Mechanized elements, once the core of their offensive strength, were largely immobilized. Vehicles froze, fuel lines cracked, and engines seized, forcing many crews to abandon their tanks and half-tracks. Defensive positions, hastily fortified in the preceding weeks, became isolated pockets as Soviet troops used the cover of snowstorms to infiltrate and sever communications between German strongpoints. Casualty rates surged not only from combat, but from frostbite, exhaustion, and disease, which combined to thin the ranks at an accelerating pace. Von Leib's headquarters received increasingly dire reports from his corps commanders, warning that unless relief or withdrawal was authorized, the 16th Army risked annihilation in place. Despite the deteriorating situation, Hitler's directives to hold Tikhvin remained absolute, driven by the symbolic and strategic weight attached to the town's capture. Berlin viewed its retention as critical to demonstrating German resolve and maintaining the image of inevitability surrounding Leningrad's eventual fall. Field officers, however, recognized the growing futility of the order. Supply columns were ambushed or stranded, ammunition stocks dwindled to a fraction of operational needs, and medical facilities were overwhelmed by a tide of frostbitten and wounded soldiers. Even Luftwaffe resupply efforts faltered, with aircraft grounded by blizzards or destroyed on icy makeshift runways. German positions, though still fighting fiercely, were increasingly unable to project force beyond their immediate perimeters, ceding the initiative entirely to the Soviets. For the Red Army, the offensive came at a steep cost, but the results justified the expenditure. Assault divisions suffered devastating losses as they charged through waist-deep snow and into fortified German lines. Yet each advance further destabilized the enemy's cohesion. Soviet commanders relied heavily on small, mobile ski detachments and sappers to bypass strongpoints and destroy bridges, fuel depots, and communications. The Siberian troops proved invaluable in these conditions, using skis to traverse otherwise impassable terrain and executing flanking maneuvers that German defenders struggled to anticipate or counter. These tactics, coupled with the sheer numerical pressure Stavka brought to bear, gradually constricted the German perimeter, leaving von Lieb's forces with no prospect of relief. Civilian suffering continued to frame the urgency of Soviet actions. As the battle reached its height, reports from Leningrad indicated that food rations had fallen to starvation levels, with tens of thousands dying from hunger, exposure, and disease. The ability to restore even a tenuous overland route via Tikhvin promised to prevent total catastrophe in the besieged city. Soviet propaganda leveraged these stakes, framing the battle as a fight for the very survival of one of the USSR's great cities. This narrative helped sustain morale among the exhausted Red Army soldiers, many of whom understood that their sacrifices on the Volkhov front could decide whether Leningrad endured the winter. By early December, the momentum of the campaign had shifted decisively. The Soviet pincers drew closer to cutting off German escape routes, and reports of collapsing morale and discipline among German troops multiplied. Field commanders prepared for an orderly retreat despite Hitler's orders, recognizing that to remain in Tikhvin would mean encirclement and destruction. The struggle had reached its climax, with the fate of the town and the survival of Army Group North's forward units hanging in the balance. Resistance and adaptation defined the final phase of the struggle for Tikhvin, as both armies, exhausted by weeks of attrition and the merciless winter, sought to salvage their positions. For the Germans, survival became the overriding objective. The once confident XY motorized corps, now depleted by combat, frostbite, and illness, attempted to construct improvised defensive networks along the frozen Volkhov and across the roads leading west toward Munga and Kirishi. Field engineers built snow-packed bunkers and log shelters, while retreating units mined roads and rigged bridges for demolition to delay Soviet pursuit. Infantry units, many of which had been reduced to skeletal strength, relied on captured Soviet equipment and civilian-sourced sledges to move supplies as motorized transport failed in the bitter cold. These stopgap measures, though desperate, allowed the Germans to slow the Red Army's advance, buying precious time to prevent a total rout. Yet these defensive adaptations could not overcome the systemic collapse of the German position. Supply convoys, already scarce, were relentlessly targeted by Soviet ski troops and partisans, who used their familiarity with the forests and snowfields to cut communications and ambush isolated vehicles. Ammunition shortages forced commanders to ration shells and cartridges, reducing artillery and small arms fire to a fraction of normal levels. German soldiers resorted to salvaging captured Soviet weapons and ammunition, a testament to the depth of their logistical crisis. Morale, battered by weeks of combat and exposure, eroded further as soldiers recognized the growing inevitability of withdrawal despite Berlin's insistence on holding their ground. On the Soviet side, adaptation took a different form. The Red Army, though emboldened by its gradual successes, faced enormous challenges in sustaining its momentum. Many divisions were operating at less than half strength due to casualties and exhaustion, and ammunition stockpiles ran perilously low after continuous fighting. To maintain pressure, Soviet commanders emphasized mobility over brute force, deploying ski battalions and reconnaissance units to bypass German strongpoints and disrupt their retreat routes. Improvised logistics chains, supported by civilian labor, moved food and ammunition to the front on sledges pulled by horses and even by hand, keeping frontline troops supplied despite Luftwaffe raids. Soviet forces also began integrating lessons from earlier setbacks, coordinating their artillery more efficiently and timing assaults to exploit moments of German weakness, particularly during snowstorms when visibility and enemy cohesion were at their lowest. The psychological toll on both armies was immense. For German troops, the disintegration of their advance and the constant specter of encirclement eroded any lingering belief in a quick victory. Letters and diaries from the front described the desperation of soldiers burning furniture and even parts of their own equipment for warmth, and the grim routine of hauling frostbitten comrades back from the lines. For the Soviets, while morale was buoyed by the knowledge that the enemy could be driven back, the human cost of the offensive was staggering. Entire rifle regiments were reduced to companies, and medical facilities were overwhelmed with frostbite victims alongside the wounded. Yet the broader purpose, the liberation of Tikhvin and the reopening of the route to Leningrad, sustained their resolve, even as the fighting ground on with no respite from the cold. Local civilians, many of whom had been displaced during the German advance, played an integral role in Soviet adaptation. Thousands returned to aid in clearing roads, constructing shelters, and carrying supplies to the front, often with little more than sledges and hand tools. Their contributions not only bolstered logistics, but also provided a morale boost to Soviet soldiers, who saw in this civilian effort a shared determination to resist and reclaim the region. These acts of collective endurance highlighted the broader resilience of the Soviet war effort, demonstrating that even amid near-total devastation, the population and military could cooperate to counter and ultimately reverse the enemy's gains. By the end of the first week of December, the Germans' improvised defenses were crumbling under the weight of sustained Soviet pressure. The combination of partisan disruption, relentless assaults, and the paralytic winter conditions left von Lieb with no choice but to authorize preparations for withdrawal despite Hitler's opposition. The contest around Tikhvin, once envisioned by Berlin as a swift operation to secure dominance in the north, had devolved into a battle of survival that the Wehrmacht was rapidly losing. Both armies had endured unprecedented hardships, but it was the Soviets, drawing on their environmental resilience and adaptive strategies, who now held the initiative as the decisive turning point approached. The turning point came in the second week of December 1941, as Soviet forces, now pressing from multiple directions, forced the Germans into a retreat that could no longer be postponed. General Merezkov's Volkov Front coordinated a pincer operation, with the 4th and 52nd Armies striking from the south and east, while elements of the 54th Army moved from the north to sever the main routes back toward Maa and the supply hubs west of Tikhvin. These thrusts, supported by ski detachments cutting across the forests, aimed not simply to retake the town, but to encircle and destroy the core of the ex-Linksneinsteige motorized corps before it could disengage. Soviet artillery, though constrained by limited ammunition, concentrated on choke points along the frozen rivers and narrow roads, forcing the retreating German columns into bottlenecks where infantry assaults and airstrikes could inflict maximum damage. The German command, recognizing the untenable position, began a staged withdrawal under extreme duress. Von Lieb, despite Hitler's earlier prohibition against retreat, argued that maintaining the position would result in encirclement and the destruction of his forward forces. On December 7th, he issued orders for a phased pullback toward the Volkhov River line, prioritizing the evacuation of artillery, wounded, and critical supplies. The retreat quickly devolved into chaos as Soviet ski troops harassed the flanks, partisan ambushes destroyed supply convoys, and blizzards immobilized columns for hours at a time. Frostbite and exhaustion claimed thousands more as soldiers struggled through snowdrifts, abandoning heavy equipment to avoid capture or destruction. For the Red Army, the advance into Tikhvin on December 9th marked both a tactical triumph and a strategic reprieve. Soviet troops, many of whom had fought in near-constant combat for over a month, raised their banners over the devastated town amid the ruins of its rail yards and streets. The recapture reopened a vital segment of the supply corridor, linking Leningrad to the Soviet interior, enabling the continuation of the tenuous road of life across Lake Ladoga. Though the route remained perilous, frequently targeted by German air and artillery attacks, its restoration provided a lifeline for the starving city, allowing limited deliveries of food, ammunition, and fuel through the brutal winter. The victory also bolstered Soviet morale across the northern front, proving that the Wehrmacht could be not only halted but driven back after its summer and autumn successes. The consequences for the Germans were profound. The withdrawal from Tikhvin, conducted under constant Soviet pressure, left behind vast quantities of equipment: artillery pieces, trucks, tanks immobilized by cold, and ammunition dumps that could not be evacuated. German divisions emerged from the retreat battered and under strength, with some infantry units reduced to a fraction of their original manpower. The inability to hold the town or secure a junction with Finnish forces shattered the operational vision for isolating Leningrad completely, forcing Army Group North into a defensive stance that would persist for much of the next year. The psychological blow to German troops, compounded by the recognition that their blitzkrieg momentum had faltered, lingered well beyond the battle itself. For civilians in the region, the Soviet recapture of Tikhvin brought little immediate relief. The town, left in ruins by the fighting and occupation, lacked shelter, food, and basic infrastructure. Thousands of displaced residents began to return, only to find their homes destroyed or looted, and the winter conditions making survival as dangerous as the preceding combat. Soviet authorities organized emergency relief efforts, but resources were scarce, and the priority remained supporting the front and the lifeline to Leningrad. The humanitarian cost of the battle was staggering, with civilians suffering alongside soldiers as the region reeled from weeks of devastation. The turning point at Tikhvin was not simply a local success, but a strategic shift. It halted the last major German attempt to fully sever Leningrad and proved that Soviet counteroffensives, if properly coordinated and supported, could overcome even experienced German formations. It marked one of the first times in the war that a German advance was reversed on a significant scale, reinforcing to Soviet commanders and troops alike that the Wehrmacht was not invincible. This realization carried psychological and practical importance, setting the stage for broader counteroffensives across the Eastern Front as winter deepened. The aftermath of the battle unfolded in brutal conditions as the fighting subsided and both sides reckoned with the consequences. For the Germans, the retreat from Tikhvin marked the collapse of their last offensive thrust toward isolating Leningrad. Army Group North, bled by weeks of attrition, was forced into a defensive posture along the Volkhov River and tasked with holding its overstretched lines through the winter. Thousands of soldiers remained incapacitated from frostbite, illness, or wounds, while supply shortages continued to plague the surviving formations. Equipment losses were staggering. Abandoned tanks, artillery pieces, and vehicles littered the retreat routes, many deliberately destroyed to prevent Soviet capture. The psychological toll on the rank and file was equally severe. The vision of a swift northern victory, once trumpeted by German propaganda, had been replaced by the grim reality of a drawn-out, defensive struggle in terrain and weather for which they were unprepared. For the Red Army, the recapture of Tikhvin was celebrated as a rare and much-needed victory during a year dominated by retreats and catastrophic losses. Soviet forces, though triumphant, were in no better condition physically. Entire divisions had been reduced to skeletal strength by the battle, with frostbite claiming nearly as many casualties as enemy action. Ammunition stocks, already strained, were nearly depleted, and many rifle units were down to a handful of functioning heavy weapons. Despite this, the victory carried immense strategic weight. The reopening of the Tikhvin rail junction ensured that supplies could once again move to Lake Ladoga, sustaining the tenuous lifeline into besieged Leningrad. Without this corridor, the city's population and defenders would have faced even more catastrophic starvation and likely collapse during the winter of 1941-42. The devastation extended to the civilian population as well. Tikhvin itself, reduced to ruins by weeks of fighting and occupation, became a grim testament to the cost of the conflict. Returning residents found their homes burned or looted, food stores destroyed, and infrastructure shattered. Thousands faced a winter without adequate shelter or provisions, and Soviet authorities were forced to divert scarce resources to emergency relief efforts. Aid was minimal, with most available supplies prioritized for the troops and the continued sustenance of Leningrad. The suffering of civilians, compounded by displacement, malnutrition, and disease, remained a stark reminder of the broader human toll of the Eastern Front, where entire towns could be wiped out or left uninhabitable by the movements of armies. The immediate military consequences reverberated along the entire Northern Front. The Wehrmacht, denied its intended link-up with Finnish forces and the complete isolation of Leningrad, could no longer sustain offensive operations in the region. Army Group North was compelled to abandon any thoughts of a renewed drive toward the Svir River or Lake Onega, and instead focus on fortifying its positions against further Soviet attacks. The Red Army, buoyed by its success, began probing operations along the Volkhov and preparing for future offensives, though its depleted units and supply limitations prevented any immediate large-scale follow-up. The stabilization of the Northern Front allowed Stavka to redirect some reinforcements southward, bolstering the defenses of Moscow at a critical juncture in December 1941, when German forces were still threatening the Soviet capital. For the wider Soviet war effort, the victory at Tikhvin carried symbolic and practical significance. It was one of the first instances where the Red Army had successfully transitioned from defense to offense, recapturing territory and inflicting a defeat on a German force that had been advancing virtually unopposed since June. The experience gained in coordinating multiple armies, integrating Siberian reinforcements, and exploiting the environment informed future Soviet strategies. It also marked a shift in the psychological balance of the war. Soviet soldiers, commanders, and civilians alike began to believe that the tide could turn, even if the path to eventual victory would be long and costly. The German retreat and the Soviet recapture of Tikhvin also reshaped the operational priorities for the winter campaign. For Berlin, the setback forced a recalibration of resource allocation, with reinforcements and supplies diverted from the north to stabilize the central front near Moscow, where Operation Typhoon had also stalled. For the Soviets, the battle's outcome ensured that Leningrad could continue to resist even as the siege deepened, and demonstrated that determined counteroffensives could blunt and reverse the momentum of the Wehrmacht. Though far from the scale of later turning points like Stalingrad or Kursk, the consequences of Tikhvin echoed across the Eastern Front as the year drew to a close. The legacy of the Battle of Tikhvin extended far beyond the snow-covered fields and shattered streets where it was fought, shaping the course of the war in the north and altering the perception of both the Red Army and the Wehrmacht. For the Soviet Union, the victory became a cornerstone of morale during one of the darkest winters in its history. The recapture of Tikhvin not only reopened the critical supply route that kept Leningrad alive through the worst months of the siege, but also proved that German offensives could be reversed, even after months of unrelenting setbacks. It demonstrated to Soviet soldiers, commanders, and the broader population that their forces could adapt, endure, and ultimately prevail despite the formidable operational skill of the Wehrmacht. This psychological shift fed into the growing confidence that, with time, the Red Army could reclaim the initiative on other fronts as well. For Germany, the battle marked the first serious check to its seemingly unstoppable advance since the launch of Operation Barbarossa. While smaller in scale compared to the simultaneous failure of Operation Typhoon near Moscow, Tikhvin revealed structural weaknesses in the German war effort: over-reliance on mobility, inadequate winter preparation, and a logistical system unable to sustain long exposed supply lines in hostile terrain. The defeat compelled the High Command to reassess its plans in the north, abandoning ambitions of linking with Finnish forces or completing the encirclement of Leningrad. Instead, Army Group North transitioned into a largely defensive posture, fortifying positions along the Volkhov and preparing to withstand renewed Soviet pressure. The inability to achieve a decisive breakthrough before winter signaled the end of the 1941 campaign's offensive momentum and foreshadowed the long, grinding nature of the conflict to come. The human cost of the battle left deep scars on the region and its people. Thousands of civilians who returned to Tikhvin found their homes destroyed, infrastructure in ruins, and scarce resources strained to the breaking point by the needs of the front. Soviet authorities, while celebrating the liberation, struggled to provide adequate shelter and food, and many residents succumbed to exposure or starvation even after the guns fell silent. Yet the town's reconstruction, though slow, became part of a broader narrative of resilience and defiance that Soviet propaganda would highlight throughout the war. Monuments, commemorative events, and later historical accounts enshrined Tikhvin as a symbol of sacrifice and recovery, emphasizing its role in safeguarding Leningrad and demonstrating the collective will of the Soviet people. In the broader context of World War II, the battle's significance is often overshadowed by the monumental clashes that followed: Stalingrad, Kursk, and the eventual lifting of the Leningrad siege. However, for military historians, Tikhvin stands as a pivotal example of how geography, weather, logistics, and determination could outweigh the tactical advantages of an otherwise dominant force. It provided a model for later Soviet winter offensives, showcasing how mobility through ski troops, exploitation of environmental conditions, and coordinated multi-front assaults could unravel an enemy that had relied on speed and shock. The engagement also served as an early lesson for the German command that the Eastern Front would not yield quick, decisive victories, and that underestimating the Soviet capacity to regroup and counterattack could lead to costly reversals. Over the decades, the Battle of Tikhvin has been commemorated in Russia as a defining moment of the early war period, often cited alongside other key defensive and counteroffensive actions that laid the groundwork for eventual Soviet triumph. Historians continue to debate its exact weight compared to larger campaigns, but its outcomes are undeniable. It saved Leningrad from complete isolation, forced Army Group North onto the defensive, and delivered a vital boost to Soviet morale at a time when the prospect of survival itself seemed uncertain. In the winter of 1941, amid blizzards and devastation, the fight for a small rail junction became a clash whose consequences rippled across the Eastern Front, symbolizing the transition from relentless German advance to a grueling war of endurance that neither side could escape.